Hello everybody. I would like to tell you a little bit about the blocks that we're going to be paper piecing for our raffle quilt. This is COVID era in-person instructions on video. So I want to thank you for helping make the blocks for the quilt, and you should have a package of material to be put together, which should include a set of instructions, one or several pattern pieces, and the fabrics that are going to be needed to put together your block. So I'm just going to do one of the simple 5-piece blocks that make up some of the more complex blocks. So this is the instructions, and on the instructions will be the picture of the full block that will be made from the parts that you will be constructing. In this case, we have 4 of these units that will go together to make this complex friendship star. It also will include a list of the piece numbers from the pattern, the color that they should be, and the size of the piece that is provided for you. I'm still working on the dimensions. I'm testing them all out before we get ready to make the actual packages. This is the pattern piece. Each shape within the pattern has a number, and it has the color of the fabric that will be used for that piece. So this is 1 white, 2 blue, 3 dark green, 4 light green, 5 white. Now, if you like, it's not necessary, but if you like, you can cut out your pattern piece along the dotted lines. The dotted lines include a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the finished part of the design. These are the fabrics. These are test fabrics, so they are not the most beautiful. They're from my stash, things that I don't think I'm going to use, and but they will serve. They're close enough. So we'll start. The first thing that I like to do when I'm paper piecing is to score along each of the lines that are eventually going to be folded. And I usually do that with a mechanical pencil and a ruler. So I'll do that real quick. And it doesn't, you don't have to do it at the beginning. You can do it as you're making the piece, but I find it convenient to have them all scored at the beginning. All right, so the first and the most important thing to do is to make sure that you have the fabric for your piece 1 face down. You can't really tell because this is a solid fabric, but it should be right side down against the fabric for the next piece, which in this case I've cut it in black. It will be a blue. So you align these 2 pieces, and this will be where you sew your first seam. Then you fold your fabric along the line that separates the shape 1 from shape 2. And we will put this on the fabric so as to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now I will go and stitch it. We'll go over to the machine to do that. Okay, so now I've moved over to the sewing machine, and I have I again have my 1/4 inch seam allowance there. This is where we're going to be stitching. When I open up the paper, we're going to be stitching on that line. One thing that's very important is to be sure that the pieces that you're going to be cutting out will fit on the pieces of fabric that you have. So you can see this piece is going to be cut along there. It fits, but just barely. I may make this piece a little bit larger. The one underneath is, in this case, it's the same shape. So the blue, black in this case, the black and the white, they're large enough so that when I cut the fabric, I won't run off the fabric. So now I'm going to make sure that the needle will hit the the sewing line. And I should point out that in order to stitch this, you should be using a fairly short machine stitch, somewhere between 1.5 and 2. I usually like to use a length of 2. Some people prefer 1.5. This is to make removing the paper relatively easy. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch. I like to anchor my seams by doing a few stitches up and back. It's important to anchor them for paper piecing, and then just stitch on the line as close as you can to the very end, and anchor the end as well. If anything, go over the edge. It's fine to go into the seam allowance. Okay, so I'm done with that. All right, so we have the seam sewn. This is piece 1, this is piece 2, and with this paper piecing method, it will appear that piece 1 is lying underneath piece 2. That's the way the seam will be folded, and it's important to be consistent for a couple of reasons and to follow the directions. One is because you want the folds to be correct, and you want it to be the same for each of the units that you make and that everyone else is making. And the other thing is that if you don't do them in the right order, then the shape of the piece that I provided may not work for you. So go 1 through 5. Now, the success of paper piecing, I think, is often related to how well you press your seams. And there are about 3 ways you can press your seam. I'll go from low-tech to high-tech. The low-tech is your fingernail, and you just, press with your fingernail really well. Second approach is to use this nice little pressing bar. Does the same thing, and your fingers don't get quite as sore. The way that I do it these days is I got this cute little iron, and I just iron that seam so that it's really well pressed down. Okay, so now everything is pressed really well. So now we're going to trim it. So I like to use this wonderful little ruler that has a 1/4 inch seam marking on the edge. So I place that on the finished edge, which is a solid line on the outside of the block, and then trim. Doesn't matter what order you do this. In this case, I'm trimming the white first, and now I'll trim the other side. And this will be blue in the quilt. I've got black here just for this test. And then this last one, all of these are being trimmed on the outside of the block. Let me just get that. Okay, now we're going to trim this part, which is going to be attached to the next piece of fabric. So in order to do this, you need to fold the pattern piece on the line between shape 1 and shape 3. Okay, and now we are going to cut the fabric to give a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you can do it with this ruler. There are also these neat add a 1/4 inch rulers, which are nice because you can just lay them up against the pattern piece. So if you have one of those, go ahead and use it if you like it. Okay, so now we have something that has a 1/4 inch seam allowance for joining to the next piece of fabric. Okay, so the next piece of fabric is dark green. Oh yeah, this is plenty big. That actually wouldn't have to be that big. Okay, so now I have them aligned, and I'll go and stitch that up, which I'm not going to video because everybody knows how to sew a seam. So I've just sewn the seam between piece 1, or shape 1 and shape 3. There you can see the seam allowance. Now this gets folded up and pressed. And I'm going to trim again on the outside edge. And now I'm going to fold the paper between shape 3 and shape 4. We're going to put on the light green fabric next. And we'll go ahead and trim the dark green piece to give a 1/4 inch seam allowance for adding the next piece, which is light green. Okay, so that's what it looks like so far. Now we're going to add the light green piece. All right. This is a really good teaching moment because I have estimated what size these pieces should be, and I laid the pattern piece against this fabric against the straight edge of this other piece. Two things. One is that it needs to be over to the right so that this part will fit on. But the other thing is that it's a little hard to see, but this piece of fabric is not big enough for the next piece that's going to go on. So I am going to go cut another piece of fabric because this one's not going to work. And this is why I'm testing them all before I put them in the kit, so that you know that the fabric piece is big enough that it should work. Okay. Okay, so now we're putting on the light green piece, which is piece shape 4 on your pattern. And I want you to notice something here, and that is that this particular shape comes back, a fair amount. So that if you were to just slap this on here on this edge of the piece, this piece, which is what you're going to be cutting, is going to run off. So pay attention to this. We want to put it on this edge of the piece because now there's plenty of room to cut the piece that we're going to need. Okay. Now if you end up sewing it and you open it up and it's not going to work, that's not a problem. You can just take out the stitching. If you cut it or start to cut it, then you're probably going to need some more fabric. Okay, so we've got this lined up so that there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. You've got the next piece of fabric with the right side facing up. So now I'm going to go ahead and stitch it. So I've just sewn the light green fabric onto this block, and we're next going to press it. Open it up and press it. And then I'm going to make the fold for the addition of the final piece between shapes 4 and 5. And you can see just by looking at it that even with adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance, there's plenty of fabric here. If it doesn't look like there's enough, it may be that you have positioned the piece not quite correctly, and you may need to take it apart and make another attempt. Okay, so that gives a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the last seam, and then trimming the outside edge. So the last piece, 5, is white. We align this with the raw edge. There's pretty much enough room. I'll make sure that the piece is maybe a little larger when I make the kits up. Okay, I've sewn this last seam that I just set up. I'm going to go ahead and press it open. And now I'm going to go ahead and trim the last outside edges. And there you have the block. A little bit of dog hair on it, but the points are coming together pretty well. And go ahead and leave don't take the paper off. We'll take it off when we decide how we're going to arrange them. We're trying to make these scrappy. These are not the fabrics that we're going to use. These are fabrics from my stash that I'm unlikely to use for anything else. I wanted to point out one other thing. If you are working with a block that has rather large pieces in it, there is a tendency or that you have to be for things to shift, and you don't want them to shift before you cut or sew. So what I will sometimes do with a large block like this, now I've sewn together this one and this one, and I need to cut here to add this last block here, is that I will go ahead and pin the paper and the fabric together so that it doesn't shift while I'm trying to cut it. I've already pressed it, which helps a lot, and I've got it as smooth as I can, but you don't want it to shift while you're cutting or sewing. So I'm just going to put a pin there and a pin close to this edge to keep it from shifting. Okay, so the next piece that I'm going to put on is this one. It's a white one. So I'm now folding on the line between the shape number 2 and shape number 3. And I'm going to again cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Pin's underneath there, so you have to make sure that things don't move. But I leave it there unless it gets in the way of either cutting or sewing. So I've got that one, and then I'm going to also trim the fabric on this side, again with the pin to keep it from shifting, giving it a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And finally, I'll go ahead and trim from the top on the outer edge of the block. Again, this is really only a concern with the larger blocks. I don't think it'll be a concern with the little the 9 and 12 inch blocks that are cut into a number of pieces. But this block is 12 inches and it doesn't have that many pieces in it, so the pieces are large.